game 1 of the tie-breaks was drawn, and so they went into game 2. Anand had the white pieces, so he opened with e4, and Gelfand repeated his knight c6 Sicilian. Maybe it's a Sveshnikov, but Anand again repeated the Rossolimo variation, and Gelfand repeated e6. Anand took, and he returned to b3 that was played in the 9th game of the match. Now, Gelfand repeated his strong novelty e5, but of course Anand was ready with a new move, and in this position, instead of playing bishop b2, if you recall, Gelfand made a draw relatively easily. Instead, Anand played d4 very quickly, so he prepared this, of course, with his team. But Gelfand responded quickly as well. d6. Anand took, and these next series of moves are completely forced. King is in check, the knight is attacked, you have to play queen e2. So black took and played bishop b7. The knight moves, and bishop g2, so black gets the pawn back. But this is a tricky situation because black is rather underdeveloped, whereas white is quite active. Anand took and played knight c3. Now you can see that quite clearly. White has 2 knights out. The rook is already developed, actually looking at the g7 pawn, preventing the bishop from developing, and white's next developing moves, bishop e3 or bishop f4 or bishop g5 and then rook to the middle, come very naturally indeed. Development for black is not so simple. So although Anand had been moving instantly, Gelfand had consumed a lot of time even just to get to this point, and he really consumed a lot more time in thinking out how to develop. If you play a simple move like knight f6, this actually is very poor. Then bishop e7 to prevent bishop takes f6, and now knight c6, and black is in huge trouble in this position already. So natural development isn't there for black. You have to play some tricky moves. So Gelfand played castle's queenside, and Anand slammed out bishop f4, which looks very dangerous indeed. And again, Gelfand thought for a long time here. Knight f6 is the simple developing move, but presumably he was worried about knight b5, and suddenly white's minor pieces are flying in the direction of black's king. I have a feeling that this is okay for black, but I can understand why Gelfand didn't want to risk this. It looks a little bit shaky. And Gelfand came up with a very interesting move here. At first I thought this was completely crazy, but a really interesting reply. Bishop d6. So Anand took. Now of course he could just capture the pawn on g7. But remarkably, things turn round. It's incredible. If you spend time taking material, then often you pay for it. Knight h6 is a good move. Ready perhaps to fly into f5, getting a tempo against the rook, but also of course preparing rook e8, an attack on white's king. And suddenly the position has transformed. The white king is exposed, and black's pieces suddenly look very active indeed, and I can understand why Anand didn't want to go in for that. Let's go back. So instead of taking on g7, he played rook g5, which I thought was strong, and then he took on c5. And at least, well, the rook is much more active in this case. So Anand has won a pawn. As we'll see, this was quite significant. But black is certainly in the game here. I don't think Gelfand was too unhappy with the position now, and I think bishop d6 I was very impressed by, a very pragmatic move just to develop quickly. So Anand needs to take care of his king, and he brought the knight back to block on the e-file. But this is not simple, and the fact that these pawns are split as well doesn't make life too easy for white. These pawns are potentially very strong, but they're a long way from the queening square, and in the meantime white has to take care of black's activity. Okay, this is a good move. Of course, you want to try and isolate that pawn even more, split the pawns. Knight d5 seems okay. And now bishop g4. So if the king retreats, say here, then the king looks a bit shaky on those squares. So f3, the bishop came back, but of course the pawn was supporting the knight. And, well, Anand could find only rook e1, but this was not very impressive after rook here, and then rook h1. So suddenly, it's funny, isn't it, how the game has turned around. Suddenly black has the initiative. But once again, Anand was playing very quickly indeed. Gelfand was running extremely short of time. But he has the initiative, and in rapid chess, that is all important. I want to rattle on with the moves. Gelfand playing very actively indeed, but Anand was not phased in any way, although I think I would be terrified if I saw black's rooks about to double on the 7th. But Anand moved so quickly, so confidently actually. Earlier in the match he seemed to lack confidence with some of his decisions. In the rapid play he was banging out his moves. It was so impressive. So rook takes c2 threatened. Now let's just see what happened. Now rook d1. Now if black isn't careful, there's going to be a counter-attack against his king. So this is what happened. And now rook d8 is threatened, so the rook had to come all the way back. And now the rook returned to the h-pawn. And now we get a trade of pieces. And bishop f5. And rook h5 and bishop takes c2. Okay, so we have a situation where black has rook, bishop and 2 pawns against rook, knight and 3 pawns. White is a pawn up, but this position ought to be a draw. This h-pawn is potentially quite dangerous. And of course the king, white king, is cut off on the 7th rank. Now, quite a few moves in this game. I'm going to leap forward. Basically, Anand did extremely well to get anything out of this position. And finally, he came down to 1 pawn. He had just 1 pawn left. Now, if Gelfand could sacrifice his bishop for that pawn, then it would be a draw. Rook and knight against rook is a pretty easy draw. Even when you're short of time, it's not so difficult to defend. But it's not so easy to sacrifice the bishop for the pawn, and in the meantime the king is in a little bit of trouble. And more to the point, Gelfand was down to his final few seconds. Now with each move of course you get 10 seconds added to your clock. However, when you're under such pressure it is very, very difficult to defend, and particularly against someone as tricky as Vishy Anand. And let's see what happened. First of all, king c4. So we'll see where that king is heading in a second. So Gelfand can only wait. King b4. Now this is clever. You see, you use the pawn as cover, and potentially you want to move into b6 to create mate threats. Okay, if you exchange knight for bishop, then this is a total draw. This is a dead draw. After this, and now this is called Philidor's position. It's a very well known theoretical draw. The point is that the king can't step forward. The only way you can do that is by playing b6, and then the rook comes to the back, and if the king comes there threatening something, then you just check the king away, and that is a dead draw. You can see that the king has no cover. So it would be a mistake to, in this position, to exchange knight for bishop. Remember that one. We'll come to another rook and pawn ending later on. Okay, so knight a4, excellent decision. Rook f7. Now rook comes back. Of course, exchanging rooks here would also be a mistake. With the king in front of the pawn, that would be a very simple draw indeed. So rook g5, keeping the pieces on the board. Now knight c5. Once the knight comes here, it is very tricky indeed, because there's always trouble for black's king. and the knight is somehow in a very stable position. So, you know, there are often mate threats, for example. You know, b6 could be coming, and then rook g8. So, king c7. Rook controls the 6th rank. You never know, there could be a switch at some point, but also b6 could be threatened as well. The king came back, but now once the king moves away from in front of the pawn, you know, you just felt that Anand was always going to have chances here, and indeed Gelfand blundered on this turn. Very difficult position. You know, maybe he can defend by giving a check and coming down here, but this is not simple. He played rook f5. Now he was really down to his last few seconds, but this move loses. Knight e6 check. Knight d4, forking rook and bishop. Anand exchanged and played king b6. Now, this rook and pawn ending is different. This one is winning for white because the king can be forced out from in front of the pawn. The threat is simply to drive the king away with rook here. Now, Gelfand played rook b3. Let's have a look and see what happens if rook f8. If black had one more move, then king b8 would actually be a draw. But white plays king a7, and in this position this simply wins, and pawn comes through. You check the king out of the way and the pawn goes through. Rook b3 was played, so we check the king out of the way, and now rook b8 from Anand, and in this position Gelfand resigned. So one game up for Anand. Why did he resign? Okay, this is actually a very well-known position. Let's suppose black just waits. Well, now we play king a7. If the king tries to come back, then of course you can check it away. And if rook check, then king b7. And let's say, well, here we move on again. And now what white does is free the rook. You play the rook round. Okay, let me play a few random moves for black, and let me just show you the technique for white. I mean, there are several ways to win, but okay. First of all, we check the king as far away from the pawn as possible. Okay, now we can move this one out of the way. There are other ways to win, but this is a pretty foolproof way. Okay, black waits. Now we've cut the king off. That's important. And then we can play this. This is the Lucena position, or Lucena position, and named after the Spanish player who first analysed this about 500 years ago. Now, king here, and we start giving checks. There are other defences, but this gives you the rough idea. Now you're threatening to queen, and if check, then this is the point of playing the rook up to the 4th rank. The rook comes in the way, so-called building a bridge between rook and king, and pawn queens on the next turn. You see how important it was to drive the king away so it can never defend. So Anand, one game up after 2 games. Could Gelfand strike back? See you in the next clip for game 3.